What would Russia have to lose if they just let Ukraine be? It is not just Putin's ego, but his life. It is very questionable if he would be able to remain in power if he admitted defeat. And out of office he probably wouldn't survive that long. For starters, Putin and Russia have put forth a lot of reasons for this war. Some make more sense than others, and some are spun for particular audiences. In international political theoretical thinking there are two ideas which loom large: realism and liberalism. Don't let the names trip you up. It's just the names of the theories. The realism worldview says that everyone is out to get one another, that alliances are just for strength and convenience, and your friend today can be your enemy tomorrow. The ultimate goal of the state is to become as powerful as possible, and it must do so in a zero-sum game at the expense of other states. The liberalism worldview is that states can work together to achieve common goals and ultimately make conditions better, more prosperous, and more secure than they can alone. And such a condition is beneficial for the states and for their populations. That's kind of it in a couple of nutshells. It doesn't mean that realism ignores the benefits of working together. And it doesn't mean that liberalism ignores the role of power politics. The two worldviews just tend to approach issues differently. When technological advancements happen, realists will see how they apply to military and defense capabilities. Liberalists will often see other applications. Realism brought about the Cold War, the arms race, and very often wars are started by people with realist worldviews. Liberalism brought about the United Nations, the WTO, and the EU and the Schengen area. Under realism, states have to be prepared for war. Under liberalism, they find ways to make enduring peace. Some will say that the EU was able to form and take such a liberalist turn only because of the realism and protection provided by NATO and the United States and its nuclear arsenal. I'm not here to argue that one way or another. Okay, here we go. Putin is an avid follower of realism. Putin sees threats everywhere. Part of this may be a tendency for pessimism. Part of this may be an outlook informed by history. NATO says they are strengthening European security. Putin sees it as a threat. Many say that Putin is just crazy in this regard. Whether or not that is true, Putin acts in accordance with his vision. There is more to it. Putin views the Russian place in the world as a leader in that region, and particularly viewed Ukraine as an integral part of the Russian sphere of influence. Ukraine is essential to Black Sea access. Russia has a huge coastline and much of it has been worthless for most of Russia's history. Ukraine also has a huge agricultural sector and a significant industrial sector. Having these resources accessible to Russia was important to Putin. Historically, he has stated that Ukraine really doesn't exist and Ukrainians are really a type of Russian. In a maybe racist worldview, he sees Russians, and ergo Ukrainians, as beholden to Russia. However, instead of bringing progress and development and good things to Ukraine, a partnership with Russia was leaving Ukraine in a backwards non-progressive state. The people of Ukraine and its elected officials moved towards a closer tie to the EU. Putin told the president of Ukraine to squash it. The president of Ukraine was like Putin's whipping boy and he did so. That kind of thing works in Russia. So Putin figured it would be all good. The legislative and the people were incensed. They drove the president out in a way that was cheered by the West, but was honestly pretty illegal. That's why it's called a revolution. Rather than taking stock of the situation and deciding he needed to be a better neighbor, Putin took the realist approach. He saw Ukraine as weak and sent in his military to take over Crimea, guaranteeing Black Sea access and the port of Sevastopol, and sent in his military to install revolt in Donbass. The world was stunned at the realist approach and did not do much beyond rhetoric and sanctions. Now, well, He says that he sees NATO as a big looming threat. He says that Russia needs to get its old glory back, and expand its borders, and take on all the Russian people left in various neighboring states after the collapse of the USSR. He has said these things. So that makes everyone real worried, especially Georgia and Kazakhstan. If he stops fighting, Putin believes it is not only admitting defeat to a country that they should have easily controlled, but also an end to his vision of a resurgent Russia. Russia has never been on the liberalist bent. It cannot get along well with its neighbors because the Russian mindset is to trust nobody because nobody trusts them. It took a lot of work, including a lot of deal-making and incentives, to bring Germany and France to put aside their centuries-old differences and really form the core of a united Europe. These things don't happen easily, and they don't happen without friends and incentives and trust. The only friends Putin have are really Belarus and China and North Korea. Putin has made moves to incorporate Belarus into Russia, but probably later rather than sooner. China has said it wants to move on from its century of humiliation and get what used to be theirs. Hong Kong, next Taiwan, and possibly down the road Siberia. So now we are in a downward spiral. Russia has few friends who have Russia's interests at heart, because Russia never has anyone else's interests at heart. I would not be surprised if we end up with a Korea-style DMZ in Ukraine, with both sides wanting to keep fighting and not admitting defeat, but for the sake of peace reluctantly stop fighting but not putting the guns down, and having a heavily armed border cutting off cross-border access. I can see that happening. Russia would prefer that to withdrawal, and Ukraine would prefer that to endless fighting. But both will say that one day they will get what is rightfully theirs. That is all. Have a great day. Russia's interest in Ukraine extends beyond just economic or political reasons. It's also about strategic positioning and maintaining influence in the region. Read the book Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall. Written about 10 years ago, but I think still accurate. Ukraine provides access to a warm water port which Russia otherwise doesn't have. And there are other geographic reasons why controlling Ukraine also makes it much harder for Russia to be invaded by land. It would be a huge embarrassment. Going into the war, Putin made justifications and promises of denazifying Ukraine, ending harm to Russian-speaking Ukrainian citizens, pushing back NATO, etc. Failing in this task shows Putin as a weak, unfit leader. What exactly happens depends on the end result. Worst case for Russia is losing Crimea. If that happens, then Putin will probably lose power. I've heard actually quite some theories about this stuff and why the war is taking place. First of them would be good old economic reasons. A lot of European countries are getting supplied by Russia with natural gas. Guess what they discovered quite a lot of in Ukraine? Natural gas deposits, and coincidentally Russia is trying to specifically take those regions. Why? Because European countries would be free of Russian influence and still have to rely on Russian gas for electricity, etc. Ukraine has the second biggest deposits for natural gases in Europe. Another reason could be that Putin doesn't want every Western country to band together. That's why he threatened Finland and Sweden to not join NATO. In my humble opinion, even if he wins the war, he still loses. Who wants to have anything to do with Russia but China and Belarus after the Ukraine war? When your next-door neighbors are thriving, your population wonders why they aren't. That's why it's important for Russia to have a buffer between their population and NATO, EU. It allows Russia's corruption to continue to be rampant. Russia has nukes. Russia was never in danger of being invaded. They're just in danger of their population wanting a better life than being taken advantage to the degree that they are. The naval base in Mariupol and, potentially, easy access to the Mediterranean Sea, money, economic power, and the ability to use gas as leverage if Ukraine starts exploiting its own massive gas fields. Prestige. Although arguably that is already gone. Geopolitics. Loss places Russia in a position where yet another border is occupied by a neighbor with strong relationships with the West. Given the current support from the West, Ukraine is a de facto NATO nation. Loss of this conflict is seen as an existential crisis among Russian leadership. It's a nightmare scenario. By framing this in the Western media as Putin's ego is to yet again miss the geopolitical significance. It's a fine mess we're in. We can't allow the Russians to win. The Russians can't have an enemy on its border. Prestige. If a country of 144 million can't beat a country of 44 million, then you kind of suck. Russia needs the territory in Ukraine because they're sitting on one of the largest natural gas supplies in the world. Russia wanted to be the main supplier of oil and gas to Europe. If Ukraine can fill that need, then Russia won't have the leverage it needs to control the prices. They'd just turn to Ukraine. The war is only about Russia needing to control more natural resources and Ukraine paying the price. Ego and other things. Putin crossed a line that put him in a life-or-death situation. If Putin loses this war, he's a dead man walking. Even if Putin wins, there's still a chance he's a dead man anyway. He's set Russia back decades. He will not be forgotten for the damage he's done. Or there are bigger economic or political reasons behind Russia invading Ukraine that make it worth spending billions. Hundreds of people dead and being sanctioned and isolated from the majority of the world. First of all, he didn't think the consequences would be anywhere near as bad. He was expecting to conquer the whole country in a matter of days. With minimal military losses. There might have been some sanctions from other countries, but probably nothing too drastic, as Russian dominance over Ukraine would have been regarded as a fait accompli. Not something that could realistically be stopped. Controlling Ukraine would have benefited Russia in a number of ways. It has a fairly big population and economy. It has some important natural resources, including various mineral deposits and large amounts of highly productive agricultural land. It has various Black Sea ports. It would have allowed straightforward restoration of water supplies to Crimea, which had previously been conquered by Russia. With Ukraine cutting off its main water supply in response, Putin's view appears to have been that control over Ukraine would have turned Russia back into a great empire, capable of standing up to the US and China, and that he would be remembered as the guy who was responsible. But the situation is different now. He can't just go back to the way things were before the war. He has poured huge amounts of lives and money into it, and he has spent all this time stirring up pro-war sentiment. If he simply abandoned it, many people would be extremely angry with him. And more importantly, he would appear vulnerable. People would see that it is possible to defeat him. It is doubtful whether he would be able to stay in power. It's probably similar to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, but reverse. There is a great video out there that explains Putin's behavior from the perspective of him being the CEO of a massive oil company. Ukraine threatened Russian oil, gas revenues by discovering huge reserves and licensing them to Western petroleum companies. That triggered the 2014 Crimea invasion. Now that it has started, it will be difficult for Putin to stop it without losing power. This isn't an aggressive war for Putin. In the way he sees things, he's defending Russia from the West by trying to take over Ukraine before they become part of the NATO. Think about things from the perspective of a guy who views the West as the enemy of his nation and conflict between the two sides as inevitable. So the answer is pretty much nothing. Russia wants the gas and oil fields in the south of Ukraine. That is all. Another U.S. military base on its border. Oil and natural gas rights in the Black Sea. It's why he took Crimea in the first place. And wants Odessa. You're getting a lot of, "they hate us for our freedom," type naive responses like it's all about Putin's ego or life. It's not quite that. To put it simply, Ukraine is a buffer state that Russia has used since the end of the Soviet Union to keep itself somewhat separated from the NATO countries. Ukraine also has a long and important part in Russia's history. The courting of Ukraine to be NATO and the US that has been happening in recent years was known to be a dangerous game, and the last couple of decades of NATO and US foreign policy was to leave Ukraine as a buffer state under the influence of Russia. To someone who has the Cold War mindset, or has dreams of imperial Russia, Putin, the loss of Ukraine as a satellite state is an unacceptable move towards the destruction of Russia and the Russian dream of empire. I would imagine that Putin and people that think like him would see a Russian defeat in Ukraine as being pretty much the end of Russia as a country. Personally, I really can't see a reason for this war at all. Russia has no great ideological rift with capitalist societies anymore. Russia under the right leadership could just become another European state, and the commerce could benefit all of its people.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Aircast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.